Now, as I was going over some news headlines, I was thinking what was going to be the subject of today's talk. And I thought that I would go over a few. Terrorist wave continues as Palestinian leaders encourage violence against Israelis. Palestinian institutions continue vicious incitement against Israel. ISIS calls for Israel's destruction. U.S.-based imam praises that Allah destroys the Zionists. U.S.-based imam advocates violence against Israel in anti-Semitic sermon. Kardawi calls Muslims to arm against Israel and the Jews. And lastly, we've got the whole family together, Muslim Brotherhood, Hezbollah, and all Palestinian groups unite to praise deadly attack. Now that seems quite like a nary foresight or forecast or prophecy for the way in which Israel's neighbors think of it. But what I'm going to tell you today is that the present regional situation of Israel's strategic balance in terms of its northern border, its eastern border, its southern border, its assets in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, its position in Europe, its relationship with the United States of America, and its general global dominance, now ranking it as the 5th strongest army in the world, or having the 5th most strongest army in the world, puts it in a very unique place in time. Not because of the President of the United States or the downward slide of Islamism in the Middle East, but because over 70 years of development, Israel has been able to fortify itself because of its role of being a villa in a jungle. So whenever you hear about BDS being this existential threat to Israel, don't worry. When you hear about Israel's potential imminent destruction because of a nuclear-armed Iran, do not worry. When you hear about domestic strife, when over the weekend there was Palestinian flags parading throughout Kikar Rabin, Rabin Square in the middle of Tel Aviv, or before that there was domestic strife over the passing of a nationality law, I would implore you, do not worry. It is because of the strife and the tension and the regional situation that Israel has had to face day after day, not just for the last 70 years, but arguably since the first Aliyah in the late 1800s, that Israel is a stronger place today because of all it has been through and all the fraught tensions it has had to experience. So if there's one thing that you can take out of today, I think you will definitely learn that Israel's situation today is much better than it was yesterday and certainly 70 years ago. So let's get into the talk today. I'd like to first start off with a general analysis of where we stand vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Then we will get into a little bit of a regional context, understanding how Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Sunni Arab autocracies that are in the Gulf region are facing its present threats towards Israel. Then we'll talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, Iran, and its cousin, the other 800-pound gorilla, Turkey. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about the U.S.-Israel relationship and finally come back with some policy conclusions. First, on the Palestinians. This September and 1 month from now, it's almost, I think, 1 month to the day, we will find ourselves at the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Peace Accords. A day which many, one generation ago, hailed or thought hailed the end of the internecine struggle between the Palestinians and the Israelis. A struggle which had been going on since even before the Akamat Medina, the start of the beginning of Israel's independence. We find ourselves in a situation right now where Palestinians can disagree more with themselves than they disagree with Israel. 25 years after this peace process was launched, which was supposed to have joint security cooperation, joint economic cooperation, a 5-year track to be able to build a Palestinian state which would live side by side with Israel in coexistence. We are further away from peace today than we were, I would even argue, than we were before the signing of the Oslo Accords, on the precipice of violence that was going out of Tunisia, out of Jordan, out of Lebanon, and decades after decades of strife between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, I'm not saying that we are farther away from peace because of anything that Israel or the Palestinians did. What I'm saying is that the Oslo peace process has not created a paradigm for peace. It has created a paradigm for war. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm someone who is a one-stater or a two-stater, or there's some other analysts who want 8 or 9 or 10 states. Even an individual calls for Palestinian Emirates to be created throughout the rest of the land that we know between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. But what I am calling you to think about is that sometimes when institutions and edifices of diplomatic processes calcify, sometimes you have to break those processes to be able to find something new. The framework that Palestinians and Israelis exist in today, one that was created on the White House lawn between that famous or maybe infamous handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, is one that I'm imploring you not to think of as the only option to be able to attain regional stability or domestic stability, if you want to think about it that way, between Israelis and Palestinians. Let me give you an analysis of why I think that. Right now, in the West Bank, you have Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, serving his 12th year of a 4 or 5 year term as president of the Palestinian Authority. You have the Palestinian Legislative Council, the PLC, with its speaker, a member of Hamas, not being able to speak with the president, a member of Fatah. We also have civil institutions in the West Bank, some of which I was able to visit when I was in the army, some that I'm rather fond of, like the first Palestinian brewery, Taibeh Beer, the first Palestinian distillery, Al-Muqamma whiskey, and even some vineyards. A brand new Palestinian city being built for the first time since 1966, housing 200,000 to 250,000 Palestinian residents, and the bridge between Area A and B. These are the areas that Palestinians are given, whether it be domestic governance in terms of civil and security control, or just security control, or Area C, which is all controlled by Israel, called Rawabi. A man named Bashar al-Masri, coming from a long line of Palestinian entrepreneurs, decided that it would be his vision to build a new Palestinian city. And he was able to do it with Israeli architects and engineers, Palestinian labor, and American financing. That was not an outgrowth of the Oslo Accords. That was a Palestinian pulling himself up by the britches, facing both Israeli military bureaucracy and relentless Palestinian kleptocratic and corrupted institutions to be able to actually build his own place. And then in Gaza right now, you have a situation where 40% of the population is on antidepressants. 1 in 15 Palestinians are more likely to commit suicide. 70% of children under the age of 12 face dysentery because of the unpalatable salinity level of the water there. You have a leadership that openly puts its own people in jail just because they're not willing to do what the Hamas asks them to. In the second largest institution in Gaza right now, UNRWA, the Palestinian Refugee Agency, there's an ongoing mutiny against the international employees with almost a 2.5-week sit-in by UNRWA's Palestinian employees because they haven't been paid due to a U.S. aid cut of about $300 million that took place between January of this year and August of right now. But all these things, the gut reaction of the international press, of U.S. media, of European institutions, would say it's because of the siege. It's because of Israel's blockade of Gaza that this is going on. The situation in Gaza is the way it is because of the rulers of Gaza. It has nothing to do with Israel's governance over that area. Israel's job as a sovereign actor is to take care of what's going on inside Israel, to protect itself from threats both external and internal. And if the leadership of Gaza was in one way or another willing to be able to cooperate with the Israeli authorities, like they did before 2005 with the disengagement, after 2007 when they kicked out the ruling Palestinian Authority parties, we now have 11 years of blood, sweat, misery, and tears of the Gazan Palestinian population because of their own chosen leadership's inability to govern that small island. Which is, I say an island even though it's connected because it's essentially cut off from the rest of the world. Not because of Israel's choice or Egypt's choice, but because of the inability for those who reside there to choose their own destiny, which is not connected to the destruction of Israel. Now, I've basically given you 2 points of very, very depraving news, and then one of a little bit of a beacon of hope. A new Palestinian being born, a new Palestinian city being born, and 2 distinct territories which are being ruled by corrupt, Islamist, theocratic, kleptocratic, every cratic that you have, leader, or leaders, or oligarchy in the rest of the region. Now, the situation in Israel as it stands is one in which there has been a prime minister that has been in power for the past 9 years. Benjamin Netanyahu was elected in February of 2009. I believe he's now in his 4th Knesset term, with elections expected latest November of 2019, earliest tomorrow, depending on what mood the ministers wake up in. But in all seriousness, Israel right now is very stable in terms of its ability to manage a conflict. But I'm not asking Israel just to manage the situation as it stands, because there are significant symptoms and byproducts of this lack of mobility in Gaza and this lack of movement in the West Bank looking forward. And sometimes, when, as I said beforehand, you have a calcified institution, you have to break from the chains of mediocrity and of stasis and of status quo, and you have to do something to disrupt the status of the Palestinians in Gaza and the status of the Palestinians in the West Bank. Now, Bashar al-Masri was able to do it by building a city. In Gaza, it's going to take something much, much, much more violent and unpleasant. So this is where I get into something where I call the victory proposition. If anyone has been following what's been going on in Gaza for the past 4 months, from March of this year, when what was called the Great March of Return to Jerusalem, an internationally supported and Hamas-organized movement to send tens of thousands of young Palestinians to the border with Israel to face tear gas, snipers, tanks, but in turn encouraging themselves to send balloons with Molotov cocktails attached to it, burning Israeli fields, shooting at Israeli soldiers, encouraging civil disobedience, which went then to the next step of terrorist attacks against the Israeli forces who were lawfully defending their border, a border that they left 12 years ago during the Gaza, 13 years ago now, during the Gaza disengagement. We are now 13 years from the withdrawal of Israeli civilians and soldiers from Gaza, and in return we have received rockets, machine gun attacks, tunnels by land and by sea, flotillas, hateful rhetoric, incitement, arguably the most vitriolic satellite television station in all of the Middle East, Al-Quds television, coming out of Hamas-run Gaza. We have our fields burning. We have our children going to bomb shelters by way of having to play not outside in the sun, as I see this light staring down on me, but looking at fortified concrete structures on top of jungle gyms, because that is the aftermath of the Gaza disengagement. And as I said to you beforehand, the situation is much, 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 much worse on the other side of the border. Not because of Israel's unwillingness to give Gaza what it needs to develop, because of its leaders' own intransigence to be able to receive what their people rightfully deserve. So you have a situation where on one hand, violence is the response to siege. But on the other hand, the reason why there's a siege is because there is a behavioral necessity for some reason from the leadership of Gaza to commit violent attacks against Israel. Time after time. And I think there are many other leaders and analysts and former officers in the Israeli army here and politicians that will tell you how many offers were made to the Gazan leadership. How many times, whether it was Fatah or civil authorities or Hamas, was Israel willing to open up the piggy bank and to give as much support as possible. After every round of conflict, Operation Cast Lead at the end of 2009, the Paris Peace Conference, $4 billion in aid promoted to reconstruct Gaza. 2012, after Operation Pillar of Defense, $5 billion committed to rebuild Gaza. Operation Tsuketan, Protective Edge, 2014, $7 billion committed to rebuild Gaza. And then even more so, not just to rebuild, but to build up a new port, a new airport, an island being proposed in the Mediterranean Sea, which will be able to bypass Israeli ports themselves. A Palestinian-owned and operated port in Cyprus, disconnecting Palestinians from Israel once and for all. So many creative ideas, so much creative energy going into this process to be able to take Gazans out of their squalor. And what was the response? We do not negotiate with Zionists. We do not recognize those who are firing upon us when we try to breach their borders. We will not in any one which way alleviate the suffering of our people because we are strung up on our ideological underpinnings, which in one way or another cause us to continue to see our people suffer. So if you have this intransigent leadership inside of Gaza itself, and you find yourself in a situation where you have two options: to let the conflict go on a low flame until it rises up again and we get the same situation as we've had for the last 3 or 4 months with this last wave of balloons and kites, and they attached a grenade to a golden eagle and let the eagle fly over the border fence to try to explode itself on some power lines. So what's the answer to Palestinian rejectionism in Gaza or in the West Bank? And what's the answer for being able to replace a structure of a peace paradigm which in one way or another is old, is sort of rotten from within the core, and is no longer working? It's not to think, like we say in Einstein's definition of insanity, to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. What it is to have the entire body politique, the society, the culture, the economy of the Palestinians not be based on rejecting Israel, but by accepting it. And in order to get this, there's several problems that we have to address. What are the underpinnings of the conflict? Why is the status quo still holding right now? Why is Europe and the United States still pursuing this grand bargain for peace, using the same alignment that had happened between Israel and the Palestinians back in 1993? 4 reasons. 1, Islamic doctrine. Now, this isn't to say Islam is a bad thing, but if you take 2 things, waqf and fiqh. Waqf being the idea that once certain interpretations of Islam conquer an area, it becomes Muslim land. And it is your duty, not for all Muslims, but for those who interpret it this way, to hold on to that land. If Israel was once Muslim under the Ottoman Empire, under Saladin, under any other former rulers, certain individuals will say, if the Crusaders came and took our land for a few hundred years and we kicked them out, all we have to do for Israel is to wait a few hundred more years and we'll eventually kick them out. The second is fiqh, or Islamic doctrine. One is you hold on to the land. The second is you do everything that you can to expel the enemy from the land. The second underpinning of this paradigm, which is not working anymore, is international support for the Palestinian cause. If you look at every institution in the United Nations, whether it be a refugee agency solely dedicated to the Palestinian cause, 12 employees of UNRWA for every other 1 employee of every other for every other international organization. The World Food Program, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the UN Peacekeeping Force. UNRWA has more employees than all of these other agencies put together on a per capita basis. And 99% of UNRWA's employees are Palestinian. So we have an international jobs agency specifically giving an underwriting for international development aid just for Palestinians themselves. And an agency that was created in 1949 exists now to perpetrate the myth of a Palestinian right of return to Israel. So if your first 2 problems are that you have a religious interpretation that says this land, which was once your land, is permanently yours, and the second, this doctrine which tells you to keep this land and do everything you can to fight for it, allows you to do every means possible. And then you have an international agency which is saying, your argument is correct. You must do everything that you can to go back to the homes from which you once came from. And if you look at the international definition of a refugee, it's someone who left an area of conflict and they're minors up until the age of 18. But if you have citizenship in another country, if you reside in a territory which you call your home, or if you're a 3rd, 4th, or 5th generation individual, you're not a refugee. But UNRWA, the Palestinian Refugee Agency, is the only agency that grants refugees the ability to expand rather than to contract. So starting off with some 600,000 or 700,000 refugees, in 1948, it's now ballooned to 5.2 million people. 5.2 million Palestinians that think they have a right to go back to Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, Nahariya, Ashdod, Ashkelon, to make that their homes. And this is being paid for with American money and European money. The Americans are starting to wake up, but the Europeans are doubling down and even giving more money to this agency. The other element of international support for this Palestinian intransigence or rejectionism has to do with the way in which the UN was built in 1945, 46, 47. There's 3 committees that exist. 1 for administration, 1 for finance, and one for the existential right of the Palestinian people. Or, sorry, Gerald will correct me later, probably, if he's here. Yeah. Yeah. The Committee for the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. There you go. Not existential, inalienable. Anyway, so you have an entire UN Security Council standing committee which backs Palestinians to the hilt. And you can't make any change to this because 1/3 of the UN are coming from Islamic countries, another quarter are coming from European countries which have traditionally supported the Palestinians. So you have a voting bloc which will not be willing to change any way that international law or international institutions codify the Palestinian situation, giving them the bias rather than Israel. The third element of, I would say, a caustic inheritance associated with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict of why things won't move is because of the situation within Israel itself. And this is the inability for the Israeli security services and the security cabinet to take the hard process of decision-making that does not just guard the status quo, but disrupts it, which either calls for the overthrow of Hamas in Gaza, reoccupies Gaza, in the Palestinian Authority, negotiating with mayors rather than negotiating with the corrupt central authority in Ramallah. Now, an instantaneous gut reaction to all these statements that I just made is, reoccupy Gaza. How many Israeli soldiers are going to lose their lives if that happens? I answer, how many more Israeli soldiers will lose their lives if we let this situation continue the way it is? Secondly, taking out all the Hamas leadership. If you do that, they'll just be replaced by more radical leadership. My answer to you is if you knew Palestinian politics and the way in which the clans and the family system work with all the chamulot, with all the chamula, the Palestinian clan system, you would realize that there are enough Palestinian, I don't want to call them organic governance structures that exist within Gaza, but if you could find a way to be able to operate intelligence networks within Gaza, you can find a way to operate governance networks, just like Israel did in the 70s and 80s before Oslo Accords, and reverting back to that, with the intent of letting Gaza become its own state and its own entity, just not one that's ruled by Hamas. And lastly, if I'm saying that the Israeli security services aren't courageous enough to make these decisions, the response would be, how dare you question the generals who protect Israel on a day-to-day basis? How dare you think you come up to a podium in Dallas and tell these, there's 3 officers here and a major too. Probably can't hear me, but I'm going to see them shaking their heads like this if I go out. How dare you question their ability? Well, at the end of the day, it's the civilian leaders of Israel who decide how the security services act. And unfortunately, we've seen many retired generals and retired Rashi Bitachon, former heads of the security services, say the only way to deal with this conflict is to make sure that the Palestinians get just enough to leave us alone. But my response to that is when you leave the Palestinians alone, they plan the next war, while you plan for the war that just happened. So these 3 things, waqfiq mentality, or Islamic doctrine, international support, and the hesitancy of the Israeli security services to be able to deal with the situation the way it is, are all impediments to being able to get a real peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, what's the answer? How do you tackle this? And the idea is to change your mindset from one which is, let's just manage the conflict, to let's ask Israel to do what it has to do to solve the conflict on its terms, within humanitarian, legal, moral, and practical means. The way that I want the Palestinians to feel is the way that Americans felt when they woke up on May 1st, 1975, seeing, is there any Vietnam veterans here? If you remember, on your television screen, you saw the last helicopter leaving the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, going off to an American carrier, and the American defeat in South Vietnam had been cemented. America still had its army, it still had its nuclear weapons force, it still had its ability to fight in other theaters in terms of much larger strategic wars, but it lost the will to fight against the Vietnamese. America on that day was defeated. I want the Palestinians to feel the same way. That they no longer have the will to wake up in the morning, and if you're in school, you're going to learn about hating Israel. If you're out of a job, you're blaming Israel. If you're a governmental leader, you're trying to find a way to blame domestic woes on Israel. If you're a militant leader, it's no longer worth the will to fight. The Palestinians have to feel the way that America felt when it was morally defeated. And the way in which to go about that requires full U.S. backing for any Israeli decision that it will take, which will go beyond the realm of the status quo into an area which will allow, in one way or another, to think, we want a two-state solution, or a three-state solution, or a four-state solution, but we have to bring the Palestinians there because we've already been there for the last 25 years. Just in terms of public opinion polling, there's a statement that you have in Hebrew saying, Ten sahal l'natzeach. Is anyone familiar with that who's Israeli here? Let the IDF win. The second part of that statement that no one ever talks about is, what are the goals of the political class after the IDF wins? And that's something that I think has to be really thought out. Now, I said I would give you a little bit more on Syria and some other areas, but how much time do we have left? 15 minutes? 20 minutes? Okay. So that's enough on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if you are either asleep or depressed or whatever else is going on, let's get into something a little bit more exciting. So for the past 7 years, we have seen a civil war rise up in the cities of Syria. We have seen the Assad army almost on the brink of defeat, and then a crushing response from its Iranian, Lebanese, Iraqi, and Russian allies brought it back from the brink of defeat. And now we have the last bastion of Syrian resistance present in a region called Idlib in the northwest of Syria, beyond the 30% of what Syria's Kurdish population controls northeast of the Euphrates River with the support of the American government, with about 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers there. But I had the unfortunate reality of witnessing the defeat of the second to last Syrian front on the Golan Heights about 3 weeks ago. There's a base in the Golan Heights, which is on sort of in the middle. If you guys are familiar with it, it kind of looks like a kidney that's upside down, attached to the northeast of Israel. A base called Tel Saki, one of the famous battles that took place during the Yom Kippur War, where one soldier gave himself up to save some 25 or 30 other soldiers that were hidden in a bunker underneath this encampment. And in Tel Saki, you walk up, it's sort of this elevated growth that comes out of the peninsula there, a peninsular growth on the plateau. And you look 1 kilometer, 0.6 miles ahead of you, and you see blue tarps along the border fence with Syria. And what this is are not the IDF monitoring what's going on inside of Syria, but the last Syrian refugee camps literally skirting themselves up to the border because the Syrian army is about to advance on them. You see Russian Sukhoi 24 jets going down, bombing the landscape. Mushroom clouds rising beyond the Israeli-Syrian border. Seeing the last vestiges of the Syrian resistance in southern Syria literally being decimated in front of your own eyes. A deal would be reached a few days later after I left the Golan Heights, transporting the last of the Syrian rebels and also Syrian civil defense volunteers called the White Helmets, one part going up to Idlib, where the last Syrian resistance bastion is, and the other, 444 individuals associated with the White Helmets, being taken on Israeli buses, driven down through the Golan Heights, the point where Jordan, Syria, and Israel meet. Now, that facilitation of the Israelis taking Syrian rebels and moving them into Jordan, into a safe zone, was not a one-off incident. What it was the last operation in 7 years of cooperation between Syrians and Israelis trying to provide a civil outreach to the southern Syrian civil population. Israel, in the course of its 7 years being on the front lines of the Syrian civil war, but not really getting involved that much between the rebels and the Syrian government, more offering about 150 different airstrikes, interdicting strategic weapons which would otherwise threaten Israel should they be turned on it after the civil war would take place. We find ourselves in a situation where for these 7 years, over 4,000 Syrians were treated in Israeli hospitals. Over $550 million was spent on Syrian healthcare by the Israeli government, where the Israelis didn't receive $1 from the international community just to treat these Syrian civilians were facing Assad's rage. We also have a situation where the Syrian army, now that it has defeated and routed the rebels from the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, has announced only 2 days ago in Sana, the Syrian Arab news agency, that it intends to build its army to be 1/3 larger than it was on the Golan before the Syrian civil war started. So 7 years of Israeli outreach to the rebels, they even treated ISIS terrorists inside of Israeli hospitals. They didn't discriminate on who they gave care to. It could have been a Syrian soldier, it could have been a member of Hezbollah. That guy's probably in Israeli jail now, but he still treated him. Syrian civilians, secular Islamists, religious jihadists, ISIS, maybe a Syrian clown if he came across the border. But in all seriousness, right now we have a situation where 7 years of warfare between Syria and the rebels that fought against it are going to the potential situation or future situation where Syria will now turn its guns on Israel after turning its guns on its own people. But there's some good news here. Because the second phase of the Syrian war, just because Syria has defeated its own domestic enemies, it now has to deal with a much more graver situation, which could actually see the downfall of Bashar al-Assad. Syria now has to fight nation states. It has Israel to worry about. It has Iraq to worry about. It has Turkey to worry about. It has a nascent Kurdish polity to worry about that controls 30% of its country. It has Russia to worry about. It has Iran to worry about. Now that the war in Syria is over, or almost over, so to the victor divides the spoils. But depending on how you look at it, there's 7 different victors in Syria. Anyway, the last stricture of Syria right now finds itself to be Bashar al-Assad, where at one time in 2010, he was able to control all of the territory within the Syrian Arab Republic. But he's now only able to control his own capital. I would even go so far as to say that Syria's sovereignty with the government does not extend 5 kilometers in any which way beyond Damascus. Because the Iranians, Hezbollah, the Russians, the Turks, the Americans, Israel, the Iraqi government, the Jordanian government are all dictating the way that the activity on the ground within Syria works itself. He may claim to be able to have control over all these areas, but about 60 different negotiated ceasefires between himself and the rebels that he was fighting to limit his ability to be able to govern. Syria does not want to fight anymore, or the Syrians do not want to fight anymore. They want to rebuild. But that is not the intention of those who lost blood in that conflict. The Iranians right now are trying to build a highway from Tehran through Baghdad to Damascus, Beirut, and to access the Mediterranean Sea. This was an initiative supported by the Russians for the last 2.5 years. However, we find ourselves in a situation now where Russia is actually defending the Israeli position of not having Iran in Syria, not because it cares about Israel, but because it wants to be able to reap the spoils of its involvement in supporting Bashar al-Assad during the Syrian civil war. Russia is competing for licenses on spectrum for the Syrian cell phone system. They want to drill with Gazprom, the Russian national oil company, in wells that were abandoned and were destroyed during the Syrian civil war. They've now been able to increase their military presence that for the first time since 1977, the Russians have a deep water port outside of the Black Sea. What does this mean? That the Russians actually have the ability to put their forces outside of an area that's connected to contiguous Russia. They have an airport. They have a deployment of forces with military police that are somehow guarding the ability for the Iranians not to get in to the rest of the rest of Syria, so that they turn their weapons on Israel. On the Lebanese side with Hezbollah, over 2,000 Hezbollah fighters, something like around 5% of Hezbollah's fighting force, were killed in Syria. Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the general secretary of Hezbollah, is in one way or another facing criticism from within his own movement. After 2006, when over 1,000 Lebanese were killed during the Second Lebanon War, Nasrallah was actually on a high rather than a low. He goes and helps his neighbor without fighting Israel. And now we see that the only vestige of control or power that he had over his own militant movement was being able to point his guns towards Israel rather than on Syria. Once he got involved in Syria, he lost popularity. How do you think he'll regain popularity? Now, if we go to Jordan, we find ourselves in a situation where the king, in one way or another, is trying to find a delicate balance between the new U.S. president, President Trump, and his own domestic problems. The largest protest on Jordan's streets in 20 years took place just a few weeks ago because of the inability for him to be able to provide basic staples to his own people. Let's not forget, something like 60% of Jordan is Palestinian. Another 15 to 20% are Bedouin. The demographer will correct me though, Mr. Ettinger. I really recommend you guys go to his talk. But a majority of Jordanians are not Jordanian. They in one way or another constitute different tribes or different minority groups that build a lot of domestic pressure against him. And in Egypt right now, arguably the most friendly Egyptian president to Israel ever, El-Sisi, finds himself also facing many domestic problems. Ethiopia and Kenya are ready to go to war against Egypt right now because of the situation associated with building a brand new dam on the Nile River, on the Blue and the White Nile. Within Egypt itself, you have tourism down, traffic through the Suez Canal down, the shipment of natural gas and oil down, and also the ability for Egypt's principal industries like the production of cotton and other trinkets that were often going to areas. And a big drought has produced something like only 60% of Egypt's wheat that it consumes is grown within country. It has to consume and purchase 40% of its grain supply from other countries. Dwindling foreign currency reserves. Egypt's not in a great place either. But through all this regional strife, through all this regional squalor, there's one country which still is able to thrive and to prosper and to be able to continue to grow and expand, and in one way or another, mitigate all the problems in which is rising around it, and that's Israel. Israel has given solutions to El-Sisi to help him combat against his own domestic terror groups that are fighting against him. Israel supported the Syrian civilians in the south of the country and has even offered help for Syrian reconstruction if Bashar al-Assad will ever agree to that. Israel has gone to Jordan and has signed a defense pact that if Jordan's government is ever, and this actually goes back to the original Jordanian-Israeli peace agreement, but if Jordan's government is ever at risk of falling, Israel will step in and intervene militarily to ensure that that government stands tall. And that's just in the area around it. We haven't spoken about Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, all other countries that in one way affect Israel's interests. And Israel has even gone so far right now to put themselves in alignment with the Sunni Gulf Arab states, except for Qatar. Iran recently was responsible for the launching of an attack against Saudi and Emirati shipping in the Bab al-Manaj. I massacred that name. But the straits that are Bab al-Manaj? Bab al-Mandab. That is the strait that goes between Yemen and Djibouti on their way up into the Red Sea, and then on one way into the Suez Canal or the other way to Eilat. Israel made a statement. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, said, if this strait is threatened by Iran or its proxies, Israel will intervene militarily on behalf of Saudi and Emirati interests if they are not able to defend this waterway. So Israel is not just fighting the wars that it has in its own backyard, it's now starting to project its power throughout the Middle East. And it's doing it in alignment with former enemies. Only 14 years ago, Saudi imams were offering $25,000 to $50,000 to the family of every suicide bomber who was willing to blow themselves up in an Israeli city. Now, 14 years later, you have Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, defense minister, oil minister, and minister of everything of Saudi Arabia, saying that he admires the idea of a Jewish polity and even supporting a two-state solution. And you have Benjamin Netanyahu meeting with Saudi officials in Jerusalem. Going beyond that, an Israeli delegation now sits in Dubai at the International Renewable Energy Agency. And Emirati officials are using Israeli cybersecurity software to mitigate free speech in their own country, but at least it's a commercial partnership. So we have that to look at too. But all of this is being done in the wider context of, and I'm going to finish up here, of Israel as being a villain in a jungle versus its biggest enemies, not enemy, enemies, Iran and Turkey. Iran is the threat of today. Turkey is the threat of tomorrow. Iran, in one way or another right now, is trying to control 6 different areas of the Middle East: Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, Sana'a, and Yemen. They have a loose partnership with the Qataris, which allows them, in one way or another, to have an advocate in the Western world from an Arab ally that's right now at odds with its other Arab neighbors. And they also have a significant presence in Venezuela. The size of the American embassy in Caracas, at its height, was around 40 employees. The size of the Iranian embassy in Caracas right now is 500 employees. That we're in Texas, you may have read this in the Dallas Morning News, an investigation that was being done on the kind of passports that people were being found with when they were caught crossing illegally at the border from Mexico into Texas. 278 Lebanese nationals with Arabic-sounding names that didn't speak Spanish were caught transiting from Mexico into Texas using Venezuelan passports. The vice president of Venezuela, now on the kingpin list from the U.S. Treasury Department in terms of his narco-trafficking, is named Tariq al-Assami. Half Palestinian, half Druze, I think. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. Iran? And he's right now number 2 in the Maduro government. His uncle was one of the founders of the Syrian Ba'ath Party. This is the alignment that we have to be able to fight against. Iran extending its presence against Israel throughout the Middle East and also close to us here at home. So the conclusion, I think, is twofold. Number one, Israel is in a great place right now strategically. But number 2, we have to look at the threats that will come tomorrow, not just the threats that are coming from within us with Iran. I want to thank you very much for having me today, and I'll be glad to speak with you afterwards.